Hello and welcome. Before we begin, I invite you to make yourself as comfortable as possible. Find a cozy position, allow your body to settle, and if you can, dim the lights around you so the atmosphere feels calm and restful. I'd love to know more about you, so when you're able, please write in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these videos can travel, and I'm genuinely curious about the places and times where you join me. If you find this video soothing, please remember to like it and subscribe. That simple action helps the video reach others who might also need some rest tonight. My true wish is that you don't make it to the end of this video, because somewhere along the way, you drifted off into peaceful sleep. That would be the best outcome of all. And if there are other topics you'd like me to create future videos about, please feel free to suggest them in the comments. I want this space to be one where you feel listened to and cared for. Now, let's begin. Tonight, I will take you on a gentle journey into a hidden corner of history. A history rarely spoken of. A history of love, of power, of beauty, and of lives lived in the shadows of great sovereigns. We so often hear stories of emperors, kings, sultans, and rulers, but tonight we turn our gaze toward those who stood beside them in private. These were the male concubines, cherished companions of emperors and kings, men chosen for their grace, their charm, their beauty, or their talent. They lived not in the light of armies or councils, but in the softer glow of candles and lanterns, within chambers hung with silks and perfumed with incense. As you drift into relaxation, imagine walking quietly down the marble corridors of a palace long ago. The air is cool. The sound of your footsteps is softened by carpets woven with intricate designs. Behind carved wooden doors, you might hear whispers of laughter, the faint notes of a lute or flute, a sigh of poetry recited under one's breath. The sovereign's court was full of ceremony and display. Yet behind those walls, away from public eyes, existed tender spaces where power and vulnerability met. It is in these hidden spaces that concubines lived. They were confidants, entertainers, guardians of the ruler's solitude. Some were remembered with reverence, their names written into poems and chronicles. Others passed through history like shadows, known only to the sovereign who once held them close. And so tonight, as you prepare for rest, we will wander gently through the centuries, from the golden halls of China to the marble villas of Rome, to the jeweled courts of the Ottoman sultans. We will learn about those chosen men and the delicate roles they played in the great dramas of history. Their stories are not always grand. Often, they are quiet, tender, and sometimes sorrowful. Yet they reveal something deeply human, the desire for closeness, for beauty, for someone to trust in the stillness of night. As you listen, let your breathing stay calm and slow. Allow the images to pass gently through your mind. like drifting clouds in a twilight sky. You do not need to remember every name, every date, or every empire. You may simply float along the surface of the words, allowing them to carry you toward rest. This is not a history of war or conquest. It is a history of intimacy, of quiet moments in hidden chambers, of men whose lives remind us that even those who commanded armies and kingdoms still long for companionship, still sought the comfort of a voice, a touch, a presence by their side. And so, with the night around us, let us begin this gentle journey together. Across the centuries, in palaces of marble and courts of gold, the selection of concubines was a ritual, both delicate and deliberate. To be chosen was to step into a world of privilege and danger, intimacy and uncertainty. Unlike warriors or ministers who earned their place through conquest and strategy, concubines were chosen for qualities far more personal. They were sought for their beauty, their charm, their voice, their wit, and sometimes for the quiet strength of their presence. In ancient China, the process could begin with the emperor's officials scouring the provinces. Young men of striking appearance, graceful carriage, or delicate features might be recommended. Some were singers in the courts, their voices rising like silk threads into the night air. Others were dancers, their movements light as feathers across polished stone floors. Still others came as part of tribute, gifts from one noble house to the imperial throne. Imagine, for a moment, a youth standing quietly in the echoing hall of the Forbidden City, lantern light catching the shimmer of embroidered robes as court attendants whispered assessments of his beauty and his bearing. In such a place, a single glance from the sovereign could alter the course of a life forever. In the Ottoman Empire, the path was different, yet equally demanding. Within the Topkapi Palace, boys who entered the Andaran school were trained not only in language and politics, but also in refinement, art, and music. Some of these boys rose to become administrators and statesmen. Others, however, caught the eye of the Sultan for more intimate reasons. Their selection was less about public achievement and more about private allure. The charm of a smile, the elegance of posture, the sparkle of wit shared in a hushed conversation. In the candle-lit chambers of the palace, the Sultan might choose a favorite, someone whose presence brought him solace after the weight of council meetings and the endless burdens of empire. Rome, too, had its ways. In the days of emperors, beauty was admired in both women and men, and the conquerors of the Mediterranean often found their companions among the conquered. A young man of Greek or Egyptian birth, with luminous eyes, for a graceful stride, might be noticed and brought into the emperor's circle. There, his duty was not to legislate or to command, but to enchant, with laughter, with charm, with the simple presence of youth and beauty in a world heavy with politics. One can almost imagine the echo of sandals on marble floors, the scent of olive oil and myrrh, and the hush of silken curtains drawn across a private chamber where decisions of desire were made. The qualities that brought a man into this role were rarely written in official records. They existed, instead, in poetry, in rumor, in the unspoken knowledge of courtiers. Some rulers favored beauty above all else. Clear skin, fine bone structure, delicate hands. Others valued talent, a voice that could sing the sovereign to sleep, a mind that could quote verses of ancient poetry, a wit sharp enough to bring laughter, even on the heaviest of nights. Some were chosen for loyalty, for the quiet strength of standing beside the ruler, without ambition, no demand, and some, of course, were chosen simply because the sovereign's heart was moved, as hearts have been moved throughout all of human history. But to be chosen was not always a blessing. For every youth who entered a life of silk and luxury, there was also the shadow of impermanence. A concubine's life depended on favor, and favor was as fleeting as the seasons. What pleased a ruler one night might be forgotten the next. Behind the glittering surface of selection lay the tension of survival. Each candidate knew that a single frown, a single whisper, could bring exile or worse. The life of a concubine was a delicate balance, the gift of intimacy entwined with the risk of falling from grace. And yet, in the stillness of those chambers, there was also tenderness. Imagine the quiet moment when a ruler, weary of ceremony, dismissed his ministers and retreated to the company of someone who required no politics, no pretense, only presence. It was in these moments that the true purpose of selection revealed itself. Beyond beauty, beyond talent, the concubine was chosen to be a balm, a mirror, a companion in solitude. The sovereign, though mighty in title, was still human. He longed for laughter, for touch, for the comfort of trust. As you rest, let yourself picture those countless scenes across cultures and centuries. A young man in silk robes, standing nervously beneath the gaze of a powerful emperor. A dancer, poised at the edge of a palace chamber, waiting for music to begin. A scholar, reciting poetry beneath the flicker of oil lamps, as the ruler listens with eyes half closed in weariness. Each one, in his own way, selected not just for what he was, but for what he might bring to the sovereign's most private hours. Selection was never only about outward qualities. It was about the promise of companionship, the unspoken hope that in the midst of rule, of power, of endless responsibility, the sovereign might find rest. And so, through centuries and across continents, these choices were made. Choices that would shape lives, lift some into luxury, and cast others into obscurity. Choices that reveal, even now, the timeless truth that even those who sit upon thrones seek solace in another's presence. Once a concubine had been chosen, his life changed forever. He was lifted from the ordinary world and placed within the rarefied air of the sovereign's private chambers. The duties he carried were not the duties of generals or ministers, but they were no less important to the daily life of the ruler. For while armies defended borders and courtiers debated laws, the concubine's task was to attend to the sovereign's heart. His role was to ease loneliness, to soothe restlessness, and to remind the ruler, however briefly, of his own humanity. The life of a concubine was often structured by ritual. In China's Forbidden City, he might rise early, bathe in fragrant water, and dress in robes chosen for their softness and color. He was expected to be immaculate, for his presence reflected the dignity of the emperor himself. In the Ottoman palace, he might be summoned for lessons in music or poetry, preparing to offer performances in the evening. In Rome, the emperor's favorite might accompany him to banquets, reclining at his side as musicians played and philosophers debated. To the outside world, these duties may seem light, but in truth, they required constant vigilance, a watchfulness for the sovereign's moods, a readiness to respond with laughter, with silence, or with words of comfort. At times, the concubine was an entertainer. He might play the lute, the harp, or the flute, letting gentle melodies rise into the night air. He might sing songs of ancient heroes or recite poems written centuries before, his voice carrying into the shadows of the chamber. In some cultures, he danced, his movements graceful and deliberate, meant not to stir passion, but to calm and delight. The role of entertainer was not merely for amusement. It was a balm against the weight of power, a reminder that beauty still existed in the world outside of war and politics. At other times, the concubine was a confidant. When the ruler's ministers had departed and the palace had fallen quiet, he alone might remain to hear the sovereign's doubts, his regrets, his fears. Imagine a king, weary from battle, whispering his woes in the stillness of night. Imagine an emperor, troubled by omens or by dreams, turning to the one person who would not judge him. These conversations, never recorded in official histories, may have shaped decisions as surely as any council chamber. A single word, softly spoken, could calm a restless mind or encourage a ruler to act with mercy instead of wrath. Concubines were also guardians of secrecy. They witnessed the sovereign not as the world saw him, robed in splendor, crowned in jewels, but as he was in moments of fatigue and vulnerability. To be trusted with such intimacy was both an honor and a burden. In the stillness of the chamber, a concubine might see the sovereign's tears, hear his unguarded laughter, or hold him in quiet embrace. Yet he could never speak of these moments beyond those walls. Silence was as much a duty as affection. To betray it was to risk not only his place, but his life. In some courts, concubines were given small tasks that reflected their closeness to the ruler. They might read letters aloud, chosen for their clear voices and calm delivery. They might prepare writing tools, arranging ink and brushes with practiced care. They might bring tea or wine, pouring with a steady hand, so that the act itself became a ritual of comfort. Every gesture, however small, carried meaning. To serve in such ways was not the meaning, it was intimate, a reaffirmation of trust between sovereign and companion. But not all roles were gentle. At times, concubines became embroiled in the rivalries of the court. Their favor could bring them enemies as quickly as it brought them gifts. A jealous minister, an ambitious relative, or another concubine might conspire against them. The sovereign's affection, once a shield, could also be a spotlight that drew resentment. Thus, one of the concubine's greatest unspoken duties was survival, the art of balancing loyalty, charm, and caution within a world of intrigue. Despite the dangers, there were moments of deep tenderness. Picture the emperor reclining in his chamber, the weight of the crown set aside, as his chosen companion tells him stories of his childhood, or simply listens in silence. Picture the sultan gazing at the stars above the Bosporus, a favored youth beside him, reminding him of simpler pleasures beyond the burdens of empire. Picture Hilarion of Rome, walking with Antinous along the Nile, sharing not a throne, but a journey of the heart. These were the moments when the concubine's role revealed itself more clearly. Not as servant, not as ornament, but as companion. In the quiet space of history, these men remind us that power is never only about conquest or command. It is also about intimacy, about the need for another's presence, about the longing to be understood. The concubine's duties, though rarely carved into stone or inscribed on scrolls, were etched into the private lives of rulers. They brought laughter where there might have been silence, comfort where there might have been fear, and companionship where there might have been only solitude. As you drift deeper into rest, let yourself linger in those chambers of the past. Hear the soft notes of a lute. See the shimmer of lamplight on silk. Feel the stillness of a night shared between ruler and companion. Imagine the quiet conversation, the gentle laughter, the unspoken trust that formed the heart of their bond. In those moments, the concubine was more than an attendant. He was a reflection of the sovereign's own humanity, a reminder that even the most powerful longed for peace in the company of another. When we look across the vast span of history, most concubines remain unnamed, hidden in shadows, their lives known only to the sovereigns who once held them dear. Yet, scattered through the centuries, a few rose to lasting fame. Their names lingered in poetry, in marble, in whispered chronicles, carried forward because their bond with the ruler was so intense, so unforgettable, that history itself could not ignore them. These stories are fragments, softened by time, yet they invite us to imagine not only the figures themselves, but also the emotions that made them unforgettable. Perhaps the most renowned of all was Antinous, the beloved companion of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. Antinous was a youth of striking beauty, born along the banks of the river Bithynia, a region that now lies within modern Turkey. When Hadrian traveled through the provinces, his eyes fell upon this young man, and from that moment onward, their lives became entwined. Antinous accompanied Hadrian on journeys across the empire, to Greece, to Egypt, to the far reaches of the Roman world. In every place they visited, Antinous was seen at the emperor's side, not as a mere ornament, but as a partner in travel, in ritual, in quiet moments of reflection. His beauty was celebrated in sculpture and in coinage, his likeness cast into marble, so that even now, 2,000 years later, his face gazes at us with the same serene expression that once captivated an emperor. The story of Antinous, however, carries a sorrow that made him eternal in Roman memory. In the year 130, as Hadrian's retinue traveled along the Nile in Egypt, Antinous drowned in the river, whether by accident, by ritual sacrifice, or by some mystery that will never be solved. He vanished from Hadrian's life in the waters of the Nile. The emperor was devastated. In his grief, Hadrian did what no Roman emperor had ever done for a beloved companion. He deified him. Antinous became a god, his cult spreading across the empire. Temples raised in his honor, his image worshipped as a symbol of eternal youth and devotion. To this day, his name endures, a reminder how deeply a concubine's presence could shape even the mightiest of rulers. In the East, another story whispers through the annals of time, that of Dongxian, a favored companion of Emperor Yuan, in the glittering courts of China, filled with ministers, scribes, and soldiers. It was Dongxian who captured the emperor's heart. His rise was astonishing. From modest origins, he climbed swiftly to the highest ranks of the court, appointed to offices of trust and honor, not for his lineage or his wealth, but for the affection of the emperor himself. Their closeness was so well known that it gave rise to one of the most enduring phrases in Chinese literature, the passion of the cut sleeve. According to the story, one night, as the emperor lay with Dongxian, he awoke to find his sleeve pinned beneath his beloved's head. Rather than disturb his rest, Emperor Ai cut the sleeve of his robe so that Dongxian could continue to sleep undisturbed. This small gesture of tenderness, preserved in words across centuries, became a symbol of male love in China. Subtle, enduring, and quietly powerful. Dongxian's fate, however, shows the precariousness of such a position. When Emperor Ai died young, Dongxian was left vulnerable. Without the emperor's protection, he faced hostility of ministers who resented his influence. Accused of corruption and stripped of his titles, he fell swiftly from grace. His story tells us that he died soon after, either by his own hand or forced into despair. Yet his story lived on, not only in the cruelty of politics, but in the gentle image of a god's leave, forever linking him with tenderness and devotion. In the Ottoman Empire, where the courts of the sultans glittered with wealth and intrigue, concubines were not only women. There existed the kochik, young male dancers trained from childhood in the arts of music, movement, and charm. Dressed in dazzling garments, they perform for the sultan and his closest circle. Their dances, both playful and alluring, their movements blurring the lines between masculinity and femininity. Some of these boys were selected for intimate companionship, chosen not merely for entertainment, but for the solace they could offer behind the veils of the harem. While most names of dacoitic are lost to history, their role became famous enough that poets and travelers of the time wrote of them. They embodied the Ottoman ideal of youthful beauty. Their presence, a reminder that companionship in the palace took many forms. Some celebrated openly, others veiled in discretion. From Mughal India comes another tale, less known, but no less evocative. The Mughal emperors, surrounded by artists, poets, and musicians, often kept close companions whose talents delighted them in both public and private. In some accounts, these companions were men of exceptional grace, chosen for their ability to sing or recite Persian verse with haunting beauty. Though their names do not always survive, fragments of poetry hint at relationships that blur the line between patronage and intimacy. Within the jeweled halls of Agra or Delhi, these concubines may have whispered verses to emperors beneath the glow of oil lamps, their voices weaving comfort into the heavy silence of power. Even in Japan, the echoes of similar bonds emerge in the cultures of the wakashu, adolescent youth who were celebrated for their beauty during the Edo period. While not concubines in the strict political sense, their relationships with patrons, including powerful figures of the samurai and shogunate classes, reflected the same intertwining of desire, artistry, and companionship. Depicted in ukiyo-e prints, with delicate features and flowing hair, the wakashu embodied an ideal of fleeting beauty, a reminder that the sovereigns of the world, whether emperors or shoguns, often turned to youth and charm for solace in their private hours. What made these figures famous was not simply their beauty, for beauty fades, nor their power, which was borrowed and fragile. What made them endure in memory was the way they touched the hearts of rulers. Antinous became divine because Hadrian could not bear his loss. Dongxin became a symbol of love because Emperor Ai chose tenderness over pride. The Kuchi lived on in poetry because their dances embodied the secret desires of a glittering empire. Each of these names, and many unnamed besides, reveal how the role of the concubine was not a trivial footnote, but a thread woven deeply into the fabric of history. And so, as you drift deeper into relaxation, picture these figures not only as individuals, but as symbols of something universal. They remind us that in every age, across every culture, those who ruled still longed for intimacy. They remind us, but the grandest palaces were also filled with whispers of affection, with laughter shared in hidden rooms, with quiet gestures of tenderness that mattered more than armies or decrees. Their fame rests not only in what they did, but in how they loved. and how they were loved in return. Let your mind rest with these images. Marble statues gazing softly through centuries. Silk sleeves cut quietly in the night. Dancers moving in golden chambers. Their laughter echoing like distant bells. Hovereds reciting verses under lantern light. Their words floating like petals across the silence. These are the echoes of famous concubines, voices carried across time, reminding us of the fragility of favor, the depths of devotion, and the eternal search for comfort in the arms of another. For the male concubine, life was never entirely his own. His existence was tied to the rhythms of the sovereign's moods, to the rise and fall of favor, to the subtle turns of political fortune. And when the sovereign's heart stopped beating, when the palace fell into mourning, and the court gathered in silence, a concubine's life often shifted in an instant. Some were cast aside, forgotten as though they had never been cherished. Others were drawn deeper into the turbulence of succession struggles, and a few, though rare, managed to carve out a life of remembrance, becoming symbols of loyalty or tragedy in the chronicles of history. In some cultures, the end of a sovereign's life meant the concubine's fate was sealed as well. Ancient traditions, rooted in the idea that the ruler should not enter the afterlife alone, demanded that favored companions accompany them into death. This practice was most famously seen in ancient China, where concubines, both male and female, could be compelled to join the emperor in his tomb. Buried with treasures, sealed within chambers of stone, they became part of the eternal court. Their voices silenced, but their presence believed to accompany the sovereign into eternity. While archaeology has revealed countless stories of female companions entered in such a way, whispers persist that male favorites, too, may have been claimed by this grim custom. Imagine the weight of such a fate, to serve in life, and then to be bound into the shadows of death, never to see the sun again. But not all traditions were so final. In many courts, the death of a ruler cast concubines into uncertainty. Stripped of their protector, they faced the disdain of new regimes. For no new ruler wished to inherit the intimacy of the old. In the Han dynasty, when Emperor Ai died, Dongshu found himself adrift. Once powerful, elevated by the emperor's affection, he suddenly stood alone in a hostile court. Ministers accused him of corruption, and with no voice left to defend him, he perished soon after. His end reflected a broader truth. A concubine's influence was as fragile as gunpowder. The moment the hand that shielded them was gone, the flame often flickered and died. In the Roman world, too, the fate of male companions after an emperor's death was precarious. Antiochus' story is unusual, precisely because Hadrian elevated him beyond mortality, making him a god in his grief. For most others, anonymity returned as swiftly as it had once been lifted. The intimacy they shared was erased by the state's unwillingness to remember. Some may have lived quietly, fading into private life with whatever wealth or estates they had been granted. Others, less fortunate, found themselves cast out by political enemies or hunted for their closeness to a fallen ruler. For them, survival depended on silence, on blending into crowds beyond the palace gates. In the Ottoman courts, male companions sometimes found themselves absorbed into the machinery of the palace. The Kuchik dancers, though cherished in youth, often aged into obscurity, their beauty no longer admired, their songs no longer requested. With the death of the sultan who favored them, they might be retired with small stipends, living on the edges of Istanbul, or return to the obscurity from which they had been drawn as children. The transition could be abrupt. One day, basking in the glow of palace lamps, the next, walking nameless through crowded streets. Their lives became testimonies to the fleeting nature of beauty, the way in which power swarms could vanish like the last notes of a song. In Mughal India, the pattern was much the same. When a sovereign died, poets, musicians, and companions who had once filled the court with music and laughter often found their patrons gone, their voices suddenly unneeded. If the next emperor chose to keep them, they might survive by shifting loyalties, adapting to new tastes, perhaps even serving multiple rulers across generations. But if mistrust fell upon them, or if their loyalty to the previous sovereign was too well known, they could be dismissed or quietly exiled. A few might wander from city to city, seeking new patrons, carrying with them the memories of jeweled halls and whispered nights now gone forever. The psychological burden of this transition was immense. Concubines lived not only in luxury, but in dependence. Their value was not their own, but lent to them by the favor of one person alone. When that person was gone, what remained? Some struggled to redefine themselves, perhaps as advisors, perhaps as patrons of art, perhaps as quiet figures who raised families away from the court. Yet a shadow of their past clung to them. They were remembered, if at all, as the emperor's favorite, never quite free of that title, never truly belonging to themselves again. Yet paradoxically, a few concubines did manage to harness the memory of their bond into a kind of immortality. Antinous, of course, is the clearest example. Statues across the empire, temples bearing his name, his beauty immortalized by Hadrian's grief. But even less exalted figures sometimes lingered in cultural memory. Dong Xian's Stotzlieb story became a metaphor for tender devotion, repeated in poetry and art for centuries, long after his downfall. In this way, even when concubines were destroyed by politics, they could rise again in myth, transformed from vulnerable individuals into symbols of love, loyalty, and ethereal beauty. In some places, the fates of concubines after death of the ruler were entwined with religious ideas. In Egypt, the notion of entering the afterlife alongside the pharaoh lent sacred justification to the practice of burying companions with him. In China, Confucian ideas of hierarchy and loyalty made it seem natural, even necessary, that companions should continue to serve beyond the grave. In Rome, by contrast, the deification of Antinous was an anomaly, an emperor's personal grief overwhelming tradition. These differences remind us that the fate of a concubine was never simply a matter of personal fortune. It was shaped by the deeper currents of culture, religion, and politics. As you imagine these lives, let the images flow slowly. Picture the closing of palace doors after a ruler's funeral. The silks folded away, the music silenced. Picture a young man walking alone through gardens he once strolled with his sovereign, now forbidden to him. Picture another, cast out to the streets, his fine clothes traded for simple garments, his jewels long since sold. And then picture a statue carved in marble, preserving a face that would otherwise have been forgotten, allowing us to glimpse the memory of love that once transformed an emperor's heart. In the stillness of night, one truth emerges. The life of a concubine was always uncertain, always at risk of vanishing as soon as the sovereign's heartbeat ceased. Some were silenced by burial, others erased by politics, others forgotten by time. But a few, by chance or by devotion, lingered. They whispered to us across centuries, not only of power and peril, but also of the delicate, fleeting bonds that made them beloved. To think of them is to remember that even in the mightiest courts, tenderness mattered, and even in the grandest palaces, the fate of a single companion could change with the setting of the sun. When we step back from the stories of emperors and kings, from the jewel courts of East and West, a pattern begins to emerge. It is the pattern of human desire, woven into the fabric of power. The male concubine was never simply a figure of pleasure, nor merely a shadow in the ruler's life. He stood at the intersection of longing and authority, of beauty and fragility, embodying both the highest intimacy and the deepest vulnerability. In his story, we glimpse truth that transcends culture, truth about how power seeks companionship, how desire seeks recognition, and how fragile every human bond can be when set against the weight of history. Power has always been lonely. To sit at the pinnacle of authority, whether as emperor, pharaoh, sultan, or king, meant to carry burdens that few could share. Decisions of life and death, choices that altered the fate of nations, responsibilities too heavy for ordinary friendship. In that vast solitude, concubines became more than companions. They became the listeners of secrets, the witnesses of unguarded moments, the holders of tenderness that could not be displayed before the court. Through them, rulers found not just delight, but solace. The concubine's rule reminds us that even the most powerful sought the quiet comfort of a hand to hold, a soft reassurance of a presence beside them when the world outside grew overwhelming. Yet this intimacy was always bound to desire. Concubines were chosen for beauty, for charm, for the ability to stir longing in the sovereign's heart. They embodied an ideal that changed from culture to culture. In Rome, it was the serene Beautianus of Antinous. In Han China, the gentle devotion of Dongxian. In the Ottoman palaces, the dazzling grace of the Kuchi dancers. In Japan, the fleeting charm of the wakashu. Desire shaped them, elevated them, made them luminous for a time. But it also made them fragile, for desire is as fleeting as a candle flame. The concubine's power lasted only as long as the sovereign's gaze lingered upon him. When beauty faded, when favor waned, the ground beneath them could collapse. Desire gave them their place, and desire could take it away in a moment. This fragility was sharpened by the politics of power. Concubines lived not in the private cottages or humble homes, but in palaces where every smile was watched, where every whisper could be turned into accusation. Their closeness to rulers made them vulnerable to jealousy, to resentment, to the schemes of ministers who saw in them both a rival and a weakness. Dong Xin learned this truth when the emperor's death left him exposed. Countless others, unnamed, were swept away in the same tides, gifted wealth one day, stripped of it the next, their names erased from the chronicles as though they had never existed. The fragility of their position revealed a paradox. They were at once the most intimate and the most disposable. Yet, in that paradox lies a lesson, for though they were fragile, though their lives could be erased by a single shift of fortune, some concubines lingered in memory, precisely because they represented the vulnerability of love itself. Antinous was deified, not because he wielded armies, but because his death revealed Ariant's human grief. Dong Xian was remembered, not because he held office, but because of Bakat's leave, a moment of tenderness that defied the harshness of politics. Their fragility made them enduring. It showed that even emperors, even sultans, even kings needed to love and to be loved. This tension between power and fragility is not confined to palaces. It speaks to something within all of us. We, too, live between strength and vulnerability, between the faces we show to the world and the quiet longings we hold in private. The story of the concubine is a mirror held up to humanity itself. It reminds us that power cannot silence desire, that status cannot shield one from loneliness, that beauty cannot promise security. What lasts, what lingers, is the tenderness of connection. A gesture, a word, a presence beside us in the dark. As you reflect on these stories, imagine again the marble statue of Antinous, gazing serenely through centuries. Imagine the soft fall of silk as Emperor Haid cut his leave to let Dong Xin sleep undisturbed. Imagine the golden lamps of the Ottoman court, casting light on dancers whose movements dissolve into memory. Imagine the quiet verses whispered in Mughal palaces, words of love carried away by the night. These images, delicate and fleeting, remind us that desire is fragile, but also that fragility can become eternal when touched by devotion. Power fades. Empires crumble. Thrones are overturned. Yet the memory of a concubine's smile, the trace of a sovereign's tenderness, can endure longer than armies. They endure because they speak to what is most human in all of us: the longing to be cherished, the fear of being forgotten, the hope that love, however fragile, might leave an imprint that time cannot erase. So let this reflection settle in you, gently, like falling snow. Power and fragility are not opposites, but companions. Desire and vulnerability are not weaknesses, but truths of the human heart. The concubine story is not only about palaces and sovereigns. It is about the eternal search for closeness, about the fleeting beauty of affection, about the fragile yet enduring marks that intimacy leaves upon the soul. As you drift now, let these thoughts soften into silence. Imagine yourself in a vast hall, the lamps dimming, the voices fading, until only stillness remains. In that stillness, power dissolves, titles dissolve, but tenderness lingers. The fragility of love, its fleeting sweetness, become a kind of strength, and in that strength, you find rest.